really sure where to take and what to do with. So I will be very happy to hear everything. So as you all know, I'm working in the past year on embroidery, and specifically Moroccan embroidery during the colonial period. And through that, I'm trying to reach to information about the daily lives of women that cannot be reached through the archive. Okay. So I gathered up from both academic and non-academic sources, all kind of things that indicate the increase in crafts during COVID. And I think it's really interesting to take from all of those titles and articles, the connection between going into the domestic sphere and crafts. Once we were obligated to go into the domestic sphere, we all kind of increased the crafts in our life. My favorite title is from the New York Times, where they say people have gone full 1800. So there is also this connection to going back to history. So for me, other than the crafts I took upon myself during COVID, which is like knitting and print screening and all kind of other stuff, sewing, I kind of started to think about craft as a method of doing history. And this what led me to think about the embroidering history project. And just very quickly, I know we don't have a lot of time. I started from the archives, from textual archives, the typical historical archives, where I encountered a series of letters that were a very clear indication of domestic violence in the Jewish community in MEKNES in Morocco. Those letters are dated between 1930 and 1931, and it's basically a very worried father that is doing businesses in Panama. He's Moroccan, but he's doing businesses in Panama, and he's writing to the local rabbi of MEKNES a series of letters manifesting his worries about his daughter that is suffering. This is his phrasing, suffering from her husband. This suffering is developed later in further letters to a very clear depiction of domestic violence. And there is all kind of very interesting stuff going on. When I encountered this, I immediately tried to find more information in textual archives about domestic violence. And not surprisingly, I didn't find a lot of things. So the project I started with embroidering history, and I will get to it in a second, was kind of like, and this is why I gave this slide the title, The End That Is Also a Beginning. I was stuck. Those letters didn't let me to anything that I could do something with in the textual archive. And I kind of hoped that the embroidering history would lead me to something else. I think two very important things in those letters that is important to note here are the topic of Jewish marriage that kind of connects to how things were legally divided in the colonial period in Morocco. So again, very briefly, very broadly, the colonial regime, which was a protectorate in Morocco, had this alleged division between colonial rule and statut personnel. It's like the personal status of people, which is mainly everything that relates to marriage, divorce, and heritage, kind of were kept in the local communities, and all the other topics were in the colonial legal sphere. And because of that, when Margaret, the person suffering from her husband, wants to divorce him, she needs to get her abusive husband approval for that. So the father is kind of begging, in each letter, the father is begging the rabbi to convince the abusive husband to give this divorce to his daughter. So this is one topic that is very interesting here. Another very interesting, on top of the domestic violence broad topic, is the threat of conversion. So in one of the letters, the father mentioned that Margaret, his daughter, suffers from her husband so much that she threatened to convert. And then all kind of question raised from that. The first one is what she wants to convert to. Is it probably it's either Islam or Christianity? And this I will not go into, but the answer is probably Islam in this case. But if you have question about this, I will be happy to elaborate in different contexts. And the other question is, did she really threaten to convert? Or is it something that the father is trying to put pressure on the rabbi in order to help? So taking all of this into account, I'm jumping to the embroidering history project, which you heard a little bit about, but I will do it for the recording. I will do a brief explanation. So basically in this project, I'm meeting with Moroccan women that used to live in Morocco during the colonial period. I'm learning from them the craft of embroidery. And alongside this, I'm talking to them. I'm hearing their stories about how was it to live and what were their day-to-day experience in colonial Morocco. And there is those like several levels. So there is the oral history, there is the material culture, the embroidery itself, which is not only the thing that we create. A lot of times, just naturally, they kind of take out all the embroidery and artifacts that they brought with them or still have from Morocco. And there is the craft itself, which is both a trigger for their memory, but also this thing that, as I started with all those titles about crafts and COVID, the craft is getting us into the domestic sphere. It was something that was done in the domestic sphere in most of the time in collective situations. Yeah, just and is kind of escorting different stages of one's life through this. The project, and this is kind of what I'm trying to create, this alternative archive or supplementary archive to the textual archive, try to connect the textual archive with the embroidering history. And I want to show here one example of another woman from MEKNES. Her name is Fanny. Here you see the marriage agreement of her and her husband. They were married in 52 in MEKNES, where Margalit and her family came from. They didn't know each other. If it was one of the first questions I asked, but I think it's interesting to see from what I learned from Fanny how everything connects. So my conversation with Fanny started not from embroidery, but from a picture I found in her living room. This is Fanny's parents that are holding hands in their house, and you can see this is like the most technical like things I can do. As you can see, there is in the background this embroidered tablecloth. It's too far away and it's hard for me to say exactly, and we cannot see the colors, but in general, after watching a lot of embroidered objects, we can see probably a typical embroidery from MEKNES, the city that they came from. The second thing that Fanny showed me is a piece from her dowry, which is a white tablecloth, embroidered tablecloth with flowers. And the interesting thing that I found here is her initials, MF. It's of course in French, not in English, but this is something that I kind of framed and put aside. So remember this. Another thing that was really interesting is an embroidered tablecloth that she created in her high school. And we can see here a very typical X-shape embroidery of flowers and kind of elements that are not typically related to the geometric shapes of Moroccan embroidery. And I also found by chance in some visual archives those classes that girls used to take in the French colonial schools in Morocco. And the final thing that I want to show you here is a very big embroidered piece that Fanny have in her living room, which you don't need to be very well into embroidery in order to say this is not Moroccan. This is a very European, probably French style of embroidery that is, she brought it from Morocco, but it's in her living room. And I showed you all of this because I think it's super interesting to see in this case how this alleged separation that the colonial regime tried to do between the community and the domestic sphere that kind of was left alone to the communities and to their legal regime and the colonial French law and more public spheres. And we can see here through embroidery how the French style and the French colonial regime entered the domestic sphere in all kind of levels. So this is like one thing that I kind of want to create with those alternative or supplementary archives that I'm trying to build. And just like as a final note that I don't know what to do with still, but it's another thing that Fanny showed me. So this is a bag that you place like all kind of Jewish, like sacred Jewish objects, tefillin, if someone knows. And it is embroidered with golden thread. And the interesting thing about this is that the embroidery through golden thread was an all male craft. Women did not do it. So there is this like element within embroidery that is important to remember that, and I gave you the obvious title of gender is not only women, but there is another aspect that we can talk about. And again, this like day-to-day experience and the day-to-day life and the domestic sphere through embroidery show us a range of gender aspects. So yeah, I think this is pretty much it. I will stop the share screen. I'm not sure where this will this will take me. I have more questions than answers, but I know that I want to do those connections between the textual archive and the supplementary archives. I'm kind of feel that I'm in a rush to collect all of those, all of this information, because not a lot of women still know this craft, or can still talk in a coherent way about all of this. And yeah, I'm kind of trying not, as you all saw, there is not a lot of gender-based violence or domestic violence that I could present. And I think this is what I'm struggling the most with, is I don't want to enforce what I read in the textual archive on the people that I meet. So all those like topics that are very interesting for me will not necessarily come up from the archive, but I'm kind of trying simultaneously to see what comes up from both. And yeah, thank you for listening.